Looks like a Canadian is wreaking Islamic terror on the other side of the world. Not the first time, unfortunately, but definitely one of the more severe cases. In January, an al-Qaeda splinter group attacked a gas plant in Algeria. They held it hostage for about 4 days, killing around 40 workers and eventually themselves being killed by the army. It was organized from within Mali. Remember, that's the country currently facing civil war between the government and Islamists. And it was then taken to Algeria. The group went from Algeria to assert the might of this cell's leader, Mohamed Benchenib. Recent news tells us that a Canadian was actually among their ranks. The Algerian Prime Minister announced back in January that a Canadian named Chedad, that's all we knew about him, had actually coordinated part of this assault. A witness said Benchenib called out, "Look at this man," and how Islam has spread to Canada. Interesting. Here's a curveball for you. Other witnesses say one of the attackers, perhaps the Canadian man, had blonde hair and spoke fluent English. Security expert David Harris is a regular on Sun News Network. He joins me now in studio. David, so tell me, right off the bat, what do you make of this whole situation?
Well, it's extremely disturbing. It seems to form part of what's beginning to look like more than a pattern of Canadians or people with some kind of claim on Canadian citizenship and nationality being found out there among Islamic extremists and not infrequently in positions of some authority and influence. Remember that not long ago we had the episode involving the bombing of the bus in Bulgaria that had targeted some Israeli tourists. One, maybe two people with Canadian connections, possibly Canadians outright, seem, according to reports, to have been implicated in that. When you go beyond this, even as far as Sri Lanka, there are resentments about the role that Canada may inadvertently have played when it's come to recruiting, fundraising, and other operations that have lent themselves to terrorist activities. And on it seems to go. There are concerns about what is going on in Syria. A report that we lost our first Canadian fighting not just with the rebels, but with an avowedly Islamic extremist force. And then there are the regular reports, great concern to many Somali Canadians, incidentally, of young Somali Canadians who may have made their way into Islamic extremist forces in northern Africa. And with all of this, the promise or the possible threat that at some point, at least some among this kind of group may be returning to Canada, trained and hostile.
I want to put some graphics up on the screen of people who have been in the news for doing this sort of stuff. I mean, obviously, Omar Kadar's family, that's a big one. Different members have been coming and going. There's varying degrees of allegations between those folks. Thwaiba Kanafani, she's a person who we might say is a good guy because she was fighting with the Free Syrian Army. But you know, she went over, she was a Canadian, and she goes over, fights there, comes back here. Mohammed Hassan Hersi, stories about him, Toronto youth who was caught at Pearson Airport for trying to join Al-Shabaab. That's a Somalian sect. How did we get to the point where this is something that's possible, something that people are inclined to do? I've criticized Canada, at least from the immigration perspective, not really being a country, just more being an international refueling station to deal with your other conflicts.
Well, as one expert put it, Hotel Canada. We're good for offering benefits, social welfare, a staging base now, it might even be, for terrorism. We've been long considered, certainly by a former French counterterrorism magistrate, as a center of, if you can imagine this, North African Islamic extremism. This is no reputation to have, especially if you want to continue to have open borders with the United States and certain other of our trade interests. So I think, yes, immigration is playing a decisive role in this. We haven't even begun to see what will be emerging, and that would be my conviction in this, based on the fact that we seem to be bringing in, I think, double per capita the number of immigrants of any of the Western industrialized country. Now, most of those people, of course, are going to be good folk, but these are numbers that are impossible meaningfully to screen, and they're, I think, overwhelming our security elements and forces. And so the logical outcome will be there. It also means we're seeing political demographics shifting ominously in favor of some of the extremist doctrine embraced by certain of these groups, including the non-terroristic, non-violent groups who nonetheless push these kinds of ideological themes.
Simply because they live here and they vote.
Well, how on earth, if you think about it, could the Reviving the Islamic Spirit conference that Mr. Justin Trudeau keynoted at in December have drawn 10, 20,000 people, often young people, with a history of having invited, I think, a neo-Nazi and other Islamic extremists. This indicates a real warning to those of us average Canadians who are concerned about our loved ones and the country's future. This is a trend, and it's a dangerous trend.
David, we're going to put a tweet on the screen right now that Jason Kenney tweeted out. He's the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. He says, "I can't begin to understand those who turn their backs on Canada to embrace the death cult of jihadi extremism." Now, Jason said, okay, we need to deal with legislation such that we find a way to get rid of people's citizenship, take it away from them if they have citizenship in other countries and they've been found to be doing this sort of stuff, looking for a legislative answer, regulatory answer. Is there a legislative answer, or is it more just in the fact that this extremism has infected people and they're going to go to great lengths to articulate that and be terrorists?
Well, I mean, Mr. Kenney, as immigration minister, has initiated some useful adjustments in the system. Unfortunately, he's obviously desperately concerned, for reasons that one could only imagine, about touching the third rail of politics, and that is of doing the heroic thing in the name of Canada, and that's coming to grips with the sheer size of mass immigration.
250,000 a year.
It's absurd, and in effect, Mr. Kenney is inadvertently creating the very conditions that will produce the terrible outcomes we're warning about, as long as he refuses to deal with the mass immigration question. All these other issues may be admirable to come to terms with, but in the scheme of things, they are not really decisive. He has got to do the thing that we would all hope he would do, that the Liberals failed to do, that the NDP look as though they would fail to do, and come to grips with it. And if he won't, then the Prime Minister should direct him to do so.
David, 10-second closer. Do you think we're going to see more of this or less of this in the years ahead?
Much more of it, and within our own boundaries, that's for sure.
Wish you hadn't said that, but I'm not surprised. David Harris, security expert, thanks for joining us. As always, you can send me your